In the medical device industry, few executives have had a career as accomplished as Keith Grossman.
Leadership and CEOs, as one example, I think the successful ones are constantly trying to find a balance between two poles. And in this case, a startup leader has to have indefatigable optimism. I mean, you just have to, because everything is hard, nothing exists, but you also have to be pragmatic, and you've got to be a realist about where you are, what you have, where you're going.
So if you had a piece of advice, one or two pieces of advice to leaders, how should they interact with their boards?
If you've got good people on your board, they're probably going to see things that you might not see. Educating them, make sure they're as expert as you possibly can in your business and the issues at hand, and then hearing from them.
So is that something that you just have to do as a leader, is you've got to come in with a vision, with a strategy, and be able to make decisions quickly?
You've got to come in and say, okay, what are we doing? What is it we're going to do to really drive shareholder value? What is it we're going to do to create a leadership position in the market or to get that back? What's going to really move the needle here, and what's standing in our way?
In the medical device industry, few executives have had a career as accomplished as Keith Grossman. He's been a 4-time CEO across 3 companies with $2 billion exits. One might say that Keith has the Midas touch. But that success didn't come quickly, and it wasn't linear. Even Keith would admit that not every chapter ended in a fairy tale. Keith Grossman became CEO of Thoratec at age 35. The company had been running a clinical trial for more than a decade, had just about $1 million left on the balance sheet, and was about to be delisted. But what it did have was a technology that could meaningfully extend the lives of heart failure patients waiting for a transplant. With that technology, Keith put together a world-class leadership team and built a market where none really existed. Keith is equally candid about the limits of leadership when at Nevro, another medical device company, the tough market dynamics ultimately proved too difficult to overcome. His honesty about how markets evolve, what can and can't be done, is what makes his perspective so valuable. Today, Keith sits on multiple boards and provides some advice on how CEOs and boards can and should work together. No Spotlight Needed is proud to welcome Keith Grossman. All right. Well, thank you so much for being here. It's really great to see you. I wish you had been here in New York in person, but I understand that things happen, but this is the next best option. All right, so typically rapid fire can happen at the end of a conversation, but we're going to actually start with some rapid fire questions. Where were you born and where were you raised?
Born Indianapolis, Indiana, raised in Columbus, Ohio.
So a very good Midwest boy you were. And what did your parents do?
Well, my father was a salesman. He sold to heavy industry, things like corrugated boxes, most of his life, specialty chemicals. And my mother was a secretary, as it was called at that time. She worked for a law firm for a number of years, and then for a large utility company for one of their senior executives.
Nice.
My dad was a pretty remarkable guy. He's one of those guys that could just do anything, but he chose to. And he had opportunities to do other things, but he chose to stay as a sales rep because he liked the balance that it gave him. And I remember him saying when we were little that nothing ever happens in the world until somebody somewhere sells something.
That's true.
And that stuck with me. Probably had something to do with my initial career choice. Who knows?
There you go. Well, it does seem like you had sales in your blood. That's for sure. So, and where did you go to school?
Went to school, as I said, grew up in Columbus, went to Miami of Ohio my freshman year for 2 very important reasons. My girlfriend, now my wife, was going there, and I wanted to play football there. So substantial reasons. I ended up transferring back for more academic reasons to Ohio State. My plan was to go to vet school. At the time. And so I transferred back to finish my undergraduate at the Ohio State University.
Okay. There you go. It's interesting because my next question was going to be, were you an athlete, a creative, an academic, or other?
Well, let's see. I grew up in a very musical household, and music was for both my parents a big thing, and it was with my older sisters as well. But I grew up, I think, with a pretty keen interest in athletics. I played team sports from the time I was in first or second grade all the way up through freshman year of college. And mostly football from, high school on or so team sports was a big part of kind of who I was growing up.
Yeah, well, it does seem to be, athletics does seem to be a common theme among leadership as well, right? It's just understanding teams, showing up, et cetera.
It does. I mean, there's so many, and we've all heard them, and they've been talked about forever. But there's so many analogies between sports, particularly team sports, but not exclusively team sports, and business and leadership.
Yeah.
Either way, you're working as a team, and you've got a common set of goals, and you've got to work very hard and practice to gain skills. There are a lot of comparable. So I think for people who grew up playing team sports, I do think that there's a little bit of pattern recognition when they get into a corporate atmosphere. Yeah. I don't think it's required for success, but I think there's some advantages, sure.
Yeah. All right. Last rapid fire question is, what was your first job ever?
First job ever?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Well, I started doing things to try to make money from, I think, grade school on. So my first jobs ever would have been, I don't know which came first, if it was the paper route or washing cars or shoveling snow or mowing lawns or babysitting, but I did them all,
I love it.
starting in probably late grade school through junior high to make money. And some of them were summer jobs. Some of them I did year round to make some money, but our parents encourage us to do something to stay busy and to make some of our own spending money.
I love that. That's great. All right, so let's start talking about your professional career. You cut your teeth in a variety of different sales and marketing roles, and then Thoratec came up. So Thoratec is a manufacturer of a ventricular assist device for heart failure patients. You were 35 years old. They approached you about being a CEO. They had been public for 20 years, I think, of which 13 was running a clinical trial. They were about to be delisted and had $1 million left in the bank. So why did you decide to go to Thoratec?
Why did I take that job?
Did you want a real challenge or something?
I did. Well, listen, I was 35. There weren't companies lined up behind them offering me CEO positions. I mean, I had done just fine in my career up to that point. I came up through sales, then sales management, then marketing, and had done a 3 or 4 year stint as a general manager over a small operating division before that. So things were going fine, but I still wasn't at top of a lot of lists for a public company CEO job. So for me, this was a unique opportunity for somebody who thought they could do it, right or wrong, and was ambitious enough to try it. And I thought, based on, and you just did a nice job of describing where Thoratec was, or maybe rather wasn't at that time. I thought there wasn't a lot of downside for the company. The company had just gotten its first FDA approval after, as you said, a 13-year IDE clinical trial, which I think has to be some sort of record,
Right?
A record nobody wants to own. But nonetheless, they had the approval. And so, yes, they were run out of cash. They had been delisted. They had no team. They had no manufacturing capacity. But they had this FDA approval that was interesting and that I thought we could do something with. And I was also really, I think, enamored of the technology and the mission and what the promise of the technology for end-stage heart failure patients who just didn't have any other option. So it was really a compelling technology and mission, and an opportunity to see if I could do maybe some of the things that I thought I could do or hoped I could do.
So you had a lot to do, as you talked about. You had to do capital raise, build out a leadership team, sales, manufacturing. So how did you prioritize in those early days? What were the key priorities, and what were the things that you, I don't want to say outsourced, but you hired well to do other things?
Well, the urgent always comes before the important. And the urgent there was raising capital. We had very little of it left, and we were burning it. And we had to build manufacturing capacity, and we had to build a commercial capability to begin expanding this therapy beyond just clinical trial sites. So we had to raise capital, and we had to do it very quickly. So that was priority number one. Right behind that was putting a team together. A senior leadership team, a commercial team, and figuring out what this therapy was going to look like, how it was going to roll out, who was going to pay for it, what kind of infrastructure our customers needed to even deploy this technology and be able to manage patients once they were on these systems. And so we had a whole commercial pathway to design and a commercial engine to build. And so that was really all of that put together was a second priority. But part of that was we had to find a new facility. We had to build new manufacturing capacity.
Right.
So that we could even launch this product. We had to begin working on reimbursement because it didn't exist for this therapy. This was a brand new therapy and there was no pathway to get it paid for. So we started the long trek down a national coverage determination process. So there was a lot of heavy lifting to do to build what was kind of the foundation of the mechanical circulatory support industry.
It sounds like you were trying to, build the car, build the plane while it was, driving down the highway and, flying at however speed that airplanes do. And so team probably was pretty significant. But at some point, so your indication was for bridge to transplant. This was a temporary measure for patients who were ultimately going to hopefully get a heart transplant. But at some point, you went to your board and you said, and things were going well, it sounded like, but at some point you said to the board, this isn't going to last. So what was that? Why did you say this is not going to last? Why? What did you see or what did you predict was going to happen that you needed to do something different?
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot over the years since that chapter. And I think, leadership and CEOs as one example, really, I think the successful ones are constantly trying to find a balance between two poles. And in this case, a startup leader has to have indefatigable optimism. I mean, you just have to, because everything is hard, nothing exists, but you also have to be pragmatic. And you've got to be a realist about where you are, what you have, where you're going, what your capabilities are and are not. And I think this is one of those cases where we were trying to build an organization that believed we could build this market. But the market at that time was a small market. It was for short-term use of these technologies for patients who were waiting on the transplant list. So that's a small, finite number of patients trying to survive them long enough, and maybe days, maybe weeks, occasionally months, until they could get a transplant. So our product was well designed for that, for reasons I won't bore you or your listeners with, but it was really suitable for that indication. The problem was that was not how we were going to drive real shareholder value. Where these technologies were going and where they have since gone is for patients who aren't candidates for transplant, much, much larger number, and the patients were all dying. And so that required a different technology. It was one that we didn't have. We were working on some things. In my view, they were either not going to get there with a high degree of probability, or they just weren't going to get there soon enough. So less than 2 years into that experience, I went to the board, who was thrilled with how things were going. We were growing, and we had raised capital, and we were winning against our only competitor, and went to them and said, we don't have what it's going to take. We're either going to need to diversify ourselves, become part of a diversified offering, or we're going to need to figure out a way to accelerate some of these long-term implantable versions of this technology. So that started a long road of exploration, and it ended up with, us approaching our only competitor, a company called Thermocardio Systems.
Yeah.
And we were beating them in the market. We were taking share for bridge to transplant, but they had better technologies for the future market. They had a technology we had tried to acquire, which ultimately became HeartMate 2. And then they had in the wings and in very early development, a product that eventually became HeartMate 3. But we had the best short-term device. So we approached them. They were a majority-owned public company. We approached their corporate owner, Thermo Electron, and said, look, we should put these companies together, and we'll have something closer to critical mass. We'll have a larger, more capable sales organization. We'll have a full queue of technologies. We'll have the ability to build what's going to be a tough market to build, but we'll be able to drive some real value. Let's put these companies together. Let us run it. We think we're better suited to run it. It was our idea, and we're winning today in the market. We've got a good engine up and running, and let our board govern it. And they agreed to it,
Yeah. Shocking.
which was terrific. This ended up being just such a great deal. It did everything that we wanted to do on paper. So we put together these two companies, and we began the heavy pursuit of the HeartMate 2. We put it in clinical trials. It failed. We took it back out. We spent a year, more than that, actually making design changes. We put it back into trials, and it started succeeding really notably. And then HeartMate 3 began making progress, and that ended up becoming the modern Thoratec, or now what is Abbott's heart failure, or a good chunk of Abbott's heart failure franchise.
Well, it does seem to me that acquisition of Thermocardio Systems, I mean, they were 3 times larger than you, and somehow you got to maintain control of the business, and they got only 1 board seat. So you must be pretty good at convincing others to give up the crown jewels.
Well, I don't know, but I hope so. But they ended up doing really well. I mean, they sold their position down over time. They were a majority owner of this NewCo, and they sold down over the period of 2 or 3 secondaries over 3 or 4 years, and they did exceptionally well. They put a board member on our board who was terrific. We actually wanted to keep him on our board after they were sold out. So everything about this really did work. It was fun to be a part of, and I think without it, look, the old Thoratec would not have made it. We would have been a footnote in early stages of mechanical circulatory support. Without that merger, I think we just wouldn't have made it. One side note that what made that deal really possible, because I've often been asked, well, how did you guys get it? Why did somebody else? It was so interesting. Why didn't one of the bigger players buy it back then? Yeah. Part of the reason was, and we were betting on this because we knew that their business was not poolable. A long time ago, there used to be a merger accounting construct called pooling of interests. And you could put companies together and pretend like they had always been together. And it offered tax advantages and the public reporting of otherwise accretion and dilution that you would be reporting. And it was a real advantage. And this business was not poolable because it was majority owned. So it would have been very hard for a large earnings sensitive company to acquire. We didn't care. We didn't have any earnings. And so
right. They didn't take care. They couldn't take advantage of the tax account.
So we said, well, we don't care if you're poolable, and we would still like to merge. And I think for their owner, it represented an opportunity.
A good exit strategy, perhaps. Yeah. That's interesting. So that was well, first I would say to you, the fact that you could acknowledge maybe you didn't have those capabilities in-house, that does take, it's hard to admit, right? Sometimes it's like a parent saying, well, my kid can't get there on its own, right? But so this was around 2000. As you said, things were going well. And this was a bold move, to acquire Thermocardio Systems. And so that was, I think that closed in 2001, in early 2001.
That's
right. And so things are going well. And then there's a little bit of a roller coaster around this time. I always think of it as a roller coaster. September 11th happens for you. Your chief operating officer and your best friend, Tom Burnett, perishes on United Flight 93 that goes down in Pennsylvania. What was that like for you personally? And what was the message that you brought home to the company in order for them to keep going?
What was it like personally? Well, it was miserable, as it was for so many Americans who suffered certainly greater loss even than we did. Like, by the way, Tom's family. But it was a miserable time. Tom was my closest friend in that part of my life. It was the third company we had worked together at, and he was my chief operating officer. So I was reliant on him personally as a friend, as a confidant, and professionally as my chief operating officer. So it was a big loss. I was actually in New York with my CFO at the time. We were opening the NASDAQ market that day. So we were at the NASDAQ Center getting ready to open a market that never opened. And so we ended up being stuck in New York most of that week. But later that morning, I found out about Flight 93 and that Tom had been on it. And It was the beginning of a really difficult time. But there's a lot of times where leading an organization is fun, and it's a privilege. And there are other times where you really don't want to. You really want to say, "Hey, I'm going to take a month off here. I've got something else to think about. I'll be back."
Regroup.
You don't have that opportunity, and those are the times that are trying when you're in a leadership role. This was certainly one of them. What did we do? I mean, what could we do? We immediately started communicating with our employees. We had to restructure the company. That job had really been built around Tom, and so we restructured the senior team in a different way. We began communicating literally that day with investors by conference call, that day with employees and senior leadership by conference call. And so it was a combination of calming, I think, an organization down who had a lot of affection and respect for Tom. He was part of the family, and making sure that Tom's family was taken care of, doing everything we could as a company, and I could as an individual, make sure that was the case. He had 3 daughters under the age of 5.
Yeah.
And so it was just like it was, again, for so many people touched by that disaster in any way. It was just a miserable time. Over the years, it became part of the lore of Thoratec. Not that that's a good thing necessarily, but it became. Right. They renamed the street next to our facility after Tom, and employees would honor that every year, and it became part of the culture and part of the lore of Thoratec. That in many ways it turned into a positive thing over time.
Yeah. Well, so it was a mission-oriented company that had another mission, if you will, or another reason. So I'm sorry for everyone that was affected by that. It must have been a very difficult time, despite the fact that things for the company seem to be continually improving, right? I think shortly thereafter, you had a pivotal clinical trial, the rematch study, which read out positively.
Yeah.
The following year, you were getting FDA approval and getting reimbursement. But around that time, or maybe a few years later, I think around 2004, you went to the board and said, you may want to think about succession planning here. I was told that it was a magical time, in many ways, Keith, a great leadership team, things are going well. So why, some would say, you ended your Thoratec career early? What was the reason for that?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad somebody told you that it was a magical time. It certainly was in many ways. I mean, we were, I think the organization was recovering from the loss of Tom. We were growing. We were headed towards new markets and new technologies that we knew were going to expand our markets. Our stock was doing well. Shareholders were happy. And I think for me, keep in mind that I started that job at a pretty young age. So I was coming up on 10 years into the role. And nothing about building Thoratec was easy. I mean, that was just a lot of heavy lifting for a lot of years, a lot of bumps in the road. And I found myself, kind of just midway through my career, but having done this job for 10 years. And I think part of me knew that I ran on, certainly not crisis management, but I ran on some of the excitement of building something, driving change. And the company was very well positioned, but probably in between product life cycles, it was going to take some time. And I didn't sense that I had the same fire that I'd had every day for that job. And that's critical for that job. It's not a job where you can coast. And I thought, I went to the board and said, look, I think a year from now, here's where I think we'll be. And we were when we got there. And if we are, then I think we're in a really good spot with the team, the technology, our shareholders. It's going to be a really positive time to make a change. Let's start thinking about doing that now. So we looked at internal options. We looked at external options. I said that I would stay on the board. I did. We brought somebody, ended up bringing in somebody from the outside. I stayed on the board. I told the board I would stay on for a year or so for a transition. It ended up being 9. to my surprise. In fact, until I came back into Thoratec the second time, which I'm sure we'll probably talk about.
Well, yeah, we will.
And for me, I didn't have anything lined up. I really just wanted to kind of refresh, figure out what the next step was going to be, stay involved and help out with Thoratec, but give Thoratec a chance to, have a new leader come in with some new ideas. And it felt like the right thing to do at the time.
Yeah. Well, it was certainly a fantastic first run at Thoratec. I think you joined when it was $7.5 million, and when you left, it was over $200 million in revenue. So, I think you could safely say you did a great job for that first half, for that first run at Thoratec.
There were a couple near-death experiences along the way, but it ended up being a terrific run and good for everybody, for our patients and our centers and our employees, and I think also our shareholders.
That's great. Yeah, I call them business war wounds. Maybe you have, and you may have a couple more business war wounds along the way too.
Yeah, there's more coming in the story.
There's more coming. That's right. So the next step in your career was a bit of a surprise. You went to TPG to be part of their venture fund, and you did it for 4 years. So what did you learn during that period of time? Did you enjoy being on a different side of the table where you were actually doing the investing?
I did. I met TPG. They're a terrific and large private equity firm. They're based in San Francisco, and I knew some of their team members, and I really started working with them. Look, at some point, a year or so after I had stepped out of Thoratec, we were looking for things to do together, but the idea was more that I would be the CEO. And so we looked at some deals together. We looked at a couple of companies that did transact, but TPG ended up not being involved. And we just weren't finding, the right thing. And one day, the sort of the senior partner there said, "Well, have you thought about stepping into the investment side? We have a venture fund called TPG Biotech. We're just starting to do medtech investing. We need a partner to help lead that." And it became really intriguing to me. I thought, well, why wouldn't I try this at this point in my career? It seems I really like the people, the platform. So I decided to try it and take a little bit of a risk and try something new. And I think we were just finishing up the first fund. We raised a second fund. We invested in about half a dozen medtech companies. Probably 2/3 of our deals, maybe more than that, were biotech. But we began making some medtech investments. I also was an advisor to the larger funds looking at large scale buyout kind of deal. So I got to have sort of one foot in each fund, and it was fun. What did I learn? Well, I learned a lot about the industry. As a CEO, you're very narrow and you're very deep. You are the master of your own domain, as Seinfeld might say. You know everything there is about your sector, your market, your competitors. You don't really have time to pick your head up and stay tuned into the whole industry. This was a chance to do the exact opposite. We saw 300 or 400 ideas a year, and about all kinds of segments of the medical device space that I had never been really privy to or spent any time on. So it was a fantastic way to learn. It was intellectually stimulating, surrounded by a lot of smart people. The other thing I learned was more personal, and that is that I didn't think I really wanted to be a venture capitalist. At some point, I realized this is interesting, but I don't like it as much. I wanted the ball in my hands again. I liked a team and building a team and crafting a strategy and a mission and communicating that strategy and then chasing it quarter after quarter, year after year to accomplish big things. And that to me was great fun. And I realized at some point I wanted to do that again. But it was a terrific experience. It's a great firm, great people. And I really enjoyed it.
That's great. So you're an operator at heart, essentially.
Sure. I think we've all got a home somewhere, and sometimes it takes a couple of steps, here or there to figure out what that is.
Yeah. So in 2011, I assume you were approached by Conceptus, which is another medical device company that did a non-surgical permanent contraceptive device. So first, let's talk about how did you come to this role, the CEO role? Did it come to you, or or how did that work?
It did. I knew a couple of people on the board. I knew at least, I think, one person in the management team, and I knew some of their shareholders. And I started hearing about Conceptus from a variety of those angles. And the board approached me about coming in to run the business. The company, do you want a little bit of kind of the lay of the land of Conceptus?
So, maybe the next one, I know it was this may be arguably your first turnaround, but this was a bit of a turnaround story, or needed to be. I think it was declining sales or flat sales, very low margin business. So talk to me about maybe a little bit about what your first impressions were when you walked in the door.
Well, the reason I took the call and spent any time on it at all was, well, I'll tell you, one thing that 4 years looking at medical device ideas taught me was it's a rare occasion when you find a therapy, a device-based therapy that has demonstrably better outcomes, is less invasive for the patient with better outcomes and better side effect profile, allows the clinician to do something easier where they can make more money. And this is the big one, allows the payer to pay for that procedure, and it's less expensive for them. I mean, I just call it a trifecta, but that was actually 4 things. But right. It's rare that you find that combination. And here the company was with 20% or so penetration or less into the surgical procedure market that they were trying to replace, and they had stopped growing. I mean, completely stopped growing, and we're actually shrinking a little bit. And I thought, what am I missing? There's got to be something. If I could figure out that this is execution or culture or something, then I would be very interested. So my diligence was to find the answer to that question, and I ultimately decided this was all sort of self-inflicted. That this was a result of a combination of the culture that had been built inside the company, but also the commercial strategy that had been put in place and not changed over time. And I felt it could be fixed. And I thought it actually could be fixed pretty quickly. And and we ended up being right. And we can talk more about that if you'd like.
Yeah, no, I'd love to dig into that, because you mentioned 2 things, kind of accountability and execution. And I guess along with the execution you talked about culture and then execution. So what was the culture beforehand, and what did you need to tweak?
I think, sometimes companies, especially smaller companies who are met with a lot of success very quickly, it can become a little bit of a curse, because you don't really have to spend a lot. You do simple things initially to get a product launched. When those simple things all work and you start growing, it never forces you to figure out the harder things until the music stops. And I think for Conceptus, they had such a good product, and it met all those criteria that I ticked through. They grew very quickly, and they put a bunch of salespeople in the field, and they acquired new customers, and that's how they grew. Was call it new store sales, by setting up new customers. What was happening was, this gets is the commercial execution part. They weren't getting to standard of care in any of their customers. They were growing by adding new customers. So you can't get to standard of care in a therapy or over the course of a large geography if you can't even get to standard of care inside of a practice. And I think what was happening is we weren't putting in place the assurances to help these clinicians who were doing this procedure now in their office for the first time, to make sure they were successful, and to make sure they had multiple successes. So we would convert them, we'd sit in a case with them, then we'd move on to go find another new customer. That doesn't scale. You can't, it's too expensive to continue to try to find new customers when your old customers are no longer using the product. So it gave us an opportunity to do, and this is overly simplified, but we actually shrunk our sales organization.
Yeah.
We came up with tools and programs to focus on our existing customers to get them to standard of care. And we began growing again, and we began growing much more profitably because we didn't have the same size footprint in doing it. Now, that sounds easy. There was also 50 other things that had to be done But I think when you step into these situations, what you have to do is you have to very quickly start at the top. You just don't come in and start managing. You have to come in and start figure out, all right, top down, what are all the things that need to be changed here? But what are those 2 or 3 things that really, really matter? And what do we have to focus on right now where we'll get a huge return on our time and energy? And that was one of them. The other was really fixing the culture inside the organization, which was I don't mean this to sound derogatory to all my friends in Silicon Valley, but it was kind of this Silicon Valley of that era culture where they had this immediate success and thought, we're phenomenal. We don't need to do anything different. We don't need to work that hard. We could take Fridays off. We don't need to make decisions or respond to threats to our business. We're just really good. And we made this great product. And I think it created this lack of focus and urgency and people not holding each other accountable in the organization. There were no analytics. There were no budgets. Nobody was tracking any of these things. They hadn't segmented the market. They didn't know which customers were growing, which weren't. And so there was just kind of a laxity inside the organization process and culture. And those had to be fixed in part by new programs, in large part with some new people.
I mean, it seems like you talked about you reduced the sales force 25%, and yet, within a quarter or 2, sales started to start growing again. And is that just, as you said, it's just the focus. It's just holding people accountable for what they're supposed to do?
Yeah, I think it's amazing how it's never easy, but it's often simple in terms of the diagnosis and the prescription. And we'll come on, I'm sure, to a later experience where something very similar happened inside. The commercial organization just simply lost track of what the most important thing was, and that was great outcomes and making sure that the users wanted to continue to use the therapy for their patients and were comfortable using it. And that wasn't that hard to do because good outcomes were easy to get with this technology, but it required some help. And we had users that weren't used to doing this type of procedure in their office. They wanted to do it. They wanted to learn. But it was our job to help get them comfortable, to get them up that learning curve, get to standard of care of their practice before we moved on. And it sounds very simple, but if you stub your toe on something like that, it can really retard your growth in a meaningful way. And that's simply what had happened.
Well, I think within a year, you're back to double-digit growth, and you're back to, I think you doubled EBITDA in the first year. And then within 18 months, Bayer, the large healthcare conglomerate, came knocking, and this was your first opportunity for an exit. They bought you for $1.1 billion, if I have my numbers correct, which is an incredible run. It really, truly, a quick turnaround, 18 months, and then for Bayer to come and purchase. So your first exit. Did you think that you'd be retired after this? That this was all right? You're like, okay, I'm good.
I don't know if I thought I would. No, probably not. I think at that point I was still,
So you knew you had.
Yeah,
you knew you had more in you.
Yeah, I knew that it was a possibility, I suppose. And we had made the decision to kind of put down roots so our kids could grow up with some stability. And so I wasn't as flexible as taking the next job anywhere in the country or doing a long-term commute. We had done a lot of that early in my career, and we kind of made the commitment to stay in one place. So I knew that finding the next right thing could take some time, but I don't think I was ready to necessarily be retired. The Conceptus sale happened much more quickly than I imagined it would. We got traction on some of these initiatives much more quickly. The stock started responding, and Bayer was sort of a unique buyer, if you will, and they had the strategy in the ground for this to be very accretive for them in their model. So it worked out really well for our shareholders, but it worked out very, very quickly. So I had to sort of think about what next steps were going to be for me.
Right, exactly. You're like, I'm unemployed. A lot a lot sooner than I expected.
Good news and bad news, right?
That's right. That's right. So you spent the next several years, you were still on boards. I think, I want to come back to your board activities, but I think you've been on over 10 boards, maybe closer to 15 over your lifetime. But you were still on the Thoratec board. You had mentioned earlier that you were on for 9 years. And by 2014, the market valuation had actually round tripped from the time that you left. Gone up, come right back down. And you were watching this from the board perspective. And were you frustrated? Were you, what was going on through your mind at that point?
You have done your work, Sheetal. You're right. That's exactly what happened. The stock did really well for a while. We launched HeartMate 2 and it did exceptionally well. I was enjoying being on the board. Really liked the fellow we brought in, recruited to come in behind me years earlier. Great guy, but at some point, something started to change inside our organization, and they always do, and that's fine. And companies can continue to thrive with a different culture and different leadership. But in this case, what had happened in the interim was we got our first competitor. Keep in mind, ever since the time we merged with our only competitor, Thermo Cardio, many years prior, we really functioned as a monopolist in the LVAD space. And I always used to say to our board and to our employees, this is a blessing and a curse because it won't always be this way, and we've got to learn how to function as if we have competitors, and we've got to feel like there's somebody chasing us, even if there isn't. Well, eventually there was, and they got to market. We didn't adapt, and we responded in a way of what we were kind of indignant with our customers that they would even consider, after everything we've done for you building this therapy, how could you consider using a competitor? Well, of course they did. Every customer wants a competitor, right? They want as many of them as they can get. And so this competitor started getting traction in ways I didn't think they should have. I thought they didn't have a comparable technology in our view. The data spoke to that, but they were doing a better job competing in the field. They were doing what I think we had done some years earlier, and they were starting to win. And I was watching the culture change from the boardroom inside the company and just become a little slower, a little bit less decisive, a little bit less focused, doing too many things and not getting anything over the finish line. That was my view. And it was frustrating. And I thought, this is why I shouldn't have stayed on the board for 9 years, because I'm the ex-CEO. I'm not the right one to start pounding my fists on the table. And so I quietly went to one of our other directors who sort of de facto functioned as a lead director. And I said, look, I'm going to step off at the next cycle. And here's why. And it began a conversation, went back to the rest of the board. It came back to me in the form of, the board kind of sees things the same way, actually. Would you think about coming back in? And so I had to think about that for a little bit. And because I assumed that my trajectory there was I was going to step off that board and do something else and root for them from the sidelines. So that was something that I hadn't thought a lot about as an actual possible outcome. And but I got pretty excited about it pretty quickly. It's not often you get to go into a job like that where you already know exactly what you think needs to be done, and all the details and the people and the products and the customers. And I thought, I think there are things we can do that could very quickly that could start changing this business. And so I quickly got really energized about coming back in.
So it was more enthusiastic than a sense of duty when you decided to come back.
It was both, but I think, in fairness, I think it became enthusiasm really, really quickly. I got excited about the idea.
Yeah. So maybe the same question that I asked with Conceptus. So when you came in, what were the first impressions? What did you feel needed to change quickly? And because you knew that culture, because you knew that organization, do you think that the changes were able to happen faster?
Well, I thought so, and I think so now as as I reflect back on it, I think we were able to do things more quickly because there was a shorthand there. Because I knew the team. I'd been on the board, for 9 years post being the CEO. I mean, I had my playbook was already written in my mind. I mean, I felt I knew what needed to be done. Most of it. I mean, obviously you got to really get in there and dig around and make sure you're right. But I was able to move more quickly. I think if I'd been just coming in from the outside and didn't know that business model, it easily could have added 6 to 12 months to do the right things and really get traction. So I think it made a big difference. I think it was an accelerant.
So Keith, I'm seeing I don't want to say a repeated pattern, but perhaps some repetition of saying you have to make decisions quickly. I think obviously at the first round of Thoratec, it was, you had to build it up from scratch. And then with Conceptus coming in and saying you have to be decisive. So is that something that, you just have to do as a leader, is you've got to come in with a vision, with a strategy, and be able to make decisions quickly?
Well, I think so. I mean, I think you have to, and if you don't have one sort of ready to test to see if it's right or wrong, you have to spend the time to come up with one. And I think it's really easy sometimes when leaders come into organizations, particularly those that seem to be functioning pretty well, and just start managing, just start running things, just start sitting in on meetings, filling your calendar in, meeting people, just keeping the trains running on time. I think a situation like this, call it a turnaround or whatever term you want to use, it forces you to come in and rethink everything, but you've got to do it quickly. And you don't have the luxury of doing a year-long, strategic consulting kind of project typically. So you've got to come in and say, okay, what are we doing? What is it we're going to do to really drive shareholder value? What is it we're going to do to create a leadership position in the market or to get that back? What's going to really move the needle here, and what's standing in our way? And starting from the top down. So in the case of Thoratec, again, culture, and it always has something to do with when companies get a little bit off the rails, you can predict with almost certainty that something has changed in the culture, or at least something can be improved and made better in the culture to more directly align the culture in the organization with what the company needs to actually do. And I think that was the case here, that the company had gotten away from the real urgency and focus that creates an energy inside of company. When you're inside a company, you can tell almost immediately if that energy exists. You can feel it. If people have their heads up, they feel like they're part of decisions. They feel like decisions are going to be made, and they're going to a meeting to see that decision get made and then carry it out. The company is doing well and responding. There's an energy. People have kind of a quicker step. And that seems like it had been lost. And we had way too many projects, way too many initiatives and ideas, and none of them were moving forward. The senior leadership team was 18 people reporting into the corner office. It just didn't seem tenable. Things had just become sort of constipated in the organization. And I don't think it was intentional, by the way. I think it just happened that way. As we faced the customer, that was the real problem, because we had the customer was turning to our new competitor who was doing a nice job in the market, and we were letting them define what good looked like in terms of clinical outcomes, product attributes, customer support, and we had lost that with that leadership kind of aura with our customers, and we had to reassert it. So we started with things like that. We replaced some senior team members. We reorganized the structure of the team. We brought decisions down closer. We thinned out the number of projects and things that we were working on dramatically, from R&D to marketing and throughout the organization. We re-educated and sort of re-incentivized our sales force to do the right things, to do the things we needed them to be doing, and framed our value proposition to customers differently and simply. And it worked, and it worked very, very quickly. And so we
within
saw
a quarter.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, And we began taking market share back, and we began seeing the stock respond and sales growth coming back, and people getting excited. People feeling like, okay, what I'm doing now matters, and there's more focus. I know exactly what I have to do. I know everyone's going to know if I don't accomplish it, but I know everyone's going to know when I do. And just had that kind of visibility and energy that we were trying to put back into the organization, into the building, to get things moving again. And it was really fun, actually. That is probably the most fun episode of my career. That leadership role was coming back into Thoratec the second time. To be able to
reigniting that culture.
Exactly. You know what has to be done. You know the team. You know the customers, and you can jump in and really start acting with confidence. It was a lot of fun. It was a great outcome there, but I wish it had lasted a little longer.
Well, I was going to say, so within about a year, St. Jude comes knocking on the door. Were you prepared, or you just said to yourself, like, this is a really good opportunity, and it's probably the right time for Thoratec to be part of something bigger?
You're always prepared. I think in our industry, if you're a mid-size single product line company, you're always prepared. And it's rarely a bad idea in this industry to consolidate if it's the right thing for your shareholders. There is a lot of risk, as we'll learn in chapter next. Of being a single product company, because the macro can change, and all of a sudden you're not as excited about where you're going, and you don't have as many options. But I was surprised. We didn't really think. Keep in mind that we were doing really well, but we had our third generation product, HeartMate 3, in clinical trials. Our competitor had a next generation product in clinical trials. Neither of those technologies had revealed themselves. So we were proving that we could win again in the second generation, and we were winning. We didn't really know what was going to happen with these next gen products, and neither did anybody who might consider buying us. So we didn't really think anybody would come in before trials were disclosed and read out, and people knew where the space was going. I think that's why our buyer, who was St. Jude, came in when they did. I think they felt like they had a larger competitor who was the likely buyer for the business. And that larger competitor was preoccupied with a very large merger of equals that they had just completed. And I think they thought that they were too busy and that they wouldn't take the risk of front running this clinical trial with a buy decision. And so that's when they came in, when they did. And they came in with something that was really attractive for our shareholders. And so for us, we look at all the potential we had in the business, but also all the risk of these products and
that third trial,
and running the company as it existed, and the things that can happen in our industry. And so this is sort of a no-brainer. It's kind of bittersweet because it was a great outcome for our shareholders. We're proud of the outcome. I am, but it would have been fun to keep running that business
to go a little longer. Yeah. Well, your second $1 billion exit, $3.4 billion, I think 7 times sales and 30 times EBITDA. It's not too bad, not too shabby.
No, and that's of course why we did it. And it ended up being a really nice prize for St. Jude. And then of course, St. Jude ended up being acquired by Abbott. And I think, I believe it to be still a very important part of Abbott's business and the bulk of their congestive heart failure franchise. So, and they continue to thrive and do well. So yeah, I'm very proud of that.
Great. So now are you fully retired? Are you planning on fully retiring after Thoratec?
Actually, okay. After Thoratec, I thought, yeah, maybe I could be, because the odds of finding something else this interesting that I don't have to move or commute it's probably not going to happen. I don't think I want to go back into to venture. So I probably would be interested in running something else, but I'm okay if I don't at this point.
Yeah.
So I was sitting on 5 boards and I was, quote unquote, retired for about 4 years this time. So I think by the end of that time, I was thinking, okay, this is this is the next chapter. I'm going to be,
Yeah.
I'm going to help out on boards and stay engaged that way. And that's where I thought it was going.
Right. Interestingly enough, one of the boards that you were not sitting on was Nevro.
Right.
And so Nevro comes, and this is now 2019, and Nevro is seeing flattening growth after having triple-digit growth even just a couple of years prior. They are in an activist situation, and you get approached to do your another turnaround. So again, talk to me about how this opportunity came to you and why it was compelling.
Yeah. Again, Nevro was one of these companies where I knew about half the board pretty well, and a couple of ex-Thoratec executives were on now the Nevro team, and Nevro had done so many things right, made some really smart decisions, including my predecessor there. They made some really good decisions about how they entered the market, the way they generated clinical data. They came into essentially kind of a genericized spinal cord stimulation market with a really unique proprietary frequency and an algorithm that allowed them to truly get better results. And they proved it in a very large, expensive head-to-head clinical trial. So they took some big risks. And they made some other strategic choices along the way that were really smart. And I gave them a lot of credit then, and I still do. I think where things began to get a little bit sideways for Nevro, again, it was sort of they scaled very quickly, even more quickly than Conceptus. I mean, they went from 0 to 300, I think, as fast as most companies in our space ever have. They grew very quickly based on the clinical data, based on the newness of what they could offer these patients and both the clinician experience and the patient experience and the outcomes for treating chronic lower back and leg pain. And so they did really well, but they scaled so quickly that if you walked in that building, what you would find is a $350 million business that still felt like it, and worse, ran themselves like a 20 or 30, $40 million kind of early stage company. And so they began to get a little bit caught up in the lack of capabilities in the organization. They just didn't have any analysis on what was going on in the business, what was working, what wasn't working. What they had been very good at was hiring people, a lot of them competitive people, putting them in the field, bringing new customers over from their competitors, and ramping that way. That's a great way to start, by the way. I'm not knocking it.
Yeah.
But eventually, as they proved, it started to stop, and they topped out about, I think, 14% of the U.S. market when I got there, against 3 really big, really tough competitors, the biggest in our industry. And shareholders were getting upset. They had a shareholder who had become active with the board and was beginning to make some public noise, and the stock had started correcting down, and the company was no longer growing, and yet they had this phenomenal technology. So that was the point at which I entered. Now, I had the disadvantage this time of not really having spent any time in neuromodulation, looking at it from a distance, of course, but never being in it. And so this was a case where I had to really dig in quickly and learn whether some of my assumptions were right, learn what the key factors for success really were, what they were doing wrong, what we could change, what to focus on. And so this one probably took a little bit longer and was a little bit tougher than, say, stepping into the Thoratec case.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it did seem though with Nevro that you were making some changes and there might have been some traction, but then COVID hit, a year after you joined, and everything just seemed to stop. Obviously, elective procedures stopped, and it didn't seem like it actually recovered. It ever really recovered after COVID. Can you just talk about that?
It didn't. It didn't. Interesting. So the first year was a blast. I mean, we were making a lot of changes, and they were working. We refocused the organization on patient trials, which had to happen before they went to their permanent implant, and that the company had become kind of disconnected from the need to to drive patient trials. And that was really part and parcel of what was going on with the sales slowdown. We had to deal with a channel that had been pretty thoroughly stuffed with product the year before in 2018. And we had to kind of destock the channel, which took most of 2019. But the fundamentals of the business were growing. Our trials were growing over 20% by the second half of 2019. And things felt really good. In fact, the first quarter of 20, which would have been when COVID kicked in, I think our growth was trending at our actual revenue growth was trending at over 20%. So it was, the engine was starting to run again, and it looked like it was going to be a lot of fun. And then COVID hit and just sort of shut everything down and hit elective procedures. And we certainly were that. It's as much pain as our patients were in. It was still an elective, not a life supporting procedure. And so it shut our doctors down for some period of time, and it took a while to come back. So all of a sudden we're managing through crisis. And we immediately recapitalized the balance sheet. I think we were the first medical device company in what became a wave of refinancings throughout 2020 to do that. We did it almost immediately. So we shored up our balance sheet because our thinking was, I've never been through a pandemic before. I certainly never run a company through one, but my best guess was everybody else's best guess was it's short term. And the last thing we wanted to do was run out of money or to have to size down the organization and lose all these capabilities that we had built up. And so we built up the balance sheet. We kept the business intact, and we were going to win the pandemic. We were going to be in the best position going through it and coming out of it and hit the ground running when things came back. And it just never really happened. And so the business, and when I say the business, I mean the entire market, us and our competitors, just went kind of flatline.
To what do you attribute that, do you know, in hindsight?
And so in hindsight, I don't know that we ever came up with a crystal clear diagnosis, but I think it's certainly more clear than it was at the time. I think partly coincidental with the pandemic, maybe partly as a result of the pandemic, our clinicians began migrating to different procedures. They began, other companies, small companies began bringing them 510K approved products that allowed them to take surgical procedures and do them in the pain clinic less invasively. And so this was attractive for pain interventionalists for reasons I understand. The patients they didn't really have to follow and continually reprogram like spinal cord stim patients. It was a one-time discrete procedure. They felt like they were treating the underlying etiology and not just treating pain. They were becoming almost more surgeons than they were before, which I think a lot of our customers enjoyed and liked.
Yeah.
So I think there was a pull towards other procedures. They weren't abandoning spinal cord stim, but they weren't investing in growing this modality for their patients. They were doing other things. And I think what we realized at some point, shortly, in fact, after I handed things off to my successor there, that this market probably wasn't coming back at all to the growth rates that it had before. And so it was interesting. We had, again, here you are, a single product company with a great technology in a market that's growing. You've got all that upside leverage. You don't have all the dilution of portfolio of products that aren't growing and that kind of thing. It's a fun place to be. But when you're a single product company in a market that's stopped growing,
and
you've got big competitors, you're probably not going to get much more share from them than you've taken. We were up to 20% by that time.
Yeah.
Now you've got a problem. Our competitors all had diversified product portfolios. They could kind of spread the risk out over other things. We didn't. So along the way, I had given the board 3 years when I came into that job. I ended up doing it for 4. But along the way, I thought, okay, and frankly, my job was to get the company really moving again and put the company in diversified hands, because it was a very expensive channel to maintain. Our sales and marketing spend was the highest I'd ever been around. And so that was the goal. It was very clear a couple of years into this that the goal had changed. It was going to be more of a long-term build out of the pandemic, probably bringing in some other products. And I was no longer at a point in my career where that's kind of what I had come in to do. So I told the board, let's bring somebody in who really wants to go through that longer term building. I'll stay on the board. I did. I stayed on as exec chair and then chair. But it started becoming clear that the market probably wasn't coming back. And it was just as clear to our investors as it was to us. And so that's really how we ended up where we were. We had two alternatives: really size the expenses down so much so that you could get to profitability, and in doing so, probably cut your revenue by, pick a number, and you'd be constantly chasing things down, or become part of somebody who had a large organization they could graft this onto and have a lot more flexibility with. But we weren't in a position of strength like we were at Thoratec 1 or Thoratec 2 or Conceptus. We were at that point kind of dealing from a position of weakness. And we sort of were selling the company at that point as a defensive measure.
So, I think if I have my numbers right, so you joined when the share price was $44. It peaked at $180. When you left, it was $21, and it was sold for $5 a share. So some people would say it wasn't really a success. How might you frame that in general?
I'd say the same thing. I would say the same thing. I mean, look, no, you at the end of a career, anybody who looks back and says they batted 1,000 is either lying or somebody I've never heard of. I mean, I would say the same thing. Now, winning is always contextual, and at that moment in time, for us to find a buyer at a price that represented a premium to the market, a buyer of any kind who could help the business survive and graft it onto some larger strategic entity was a win.
Mm-hmm.
Absent that particular transaction, we would have been in a very difficult position. So, I think it was a win in terms of the options we had at that time. Do I look at that and say, boy, it's just like all my other experiences where we created a lot of shareholder value? And no, of course not. But I never could have predicted, what could have happened in the externalities of that business. And that's part of it. I mean, that's part of doing this. I think for a living, you're going to get some of those.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you definitely have to, take some risks. Some work out and some don't, right? Yeah. So now you are finally retired.
I am finally retired.
If somebody came knocked on the door, would you think of another CEO role?
I can't imagine it. I mean, I really can't. I'm very, very happy with my operating experience and track record and what I was able to learn and do and be a part of. And I really enjoy now. I'm doing some board work. I'm probably going to be doing some more here fairly soon. And I enjoy that. I enjoy, you get, after enough years, you get a pattern recognition that's much more reliable, much quicker to the point, and I think helpful to other companies who are going down a similar path. And I enjoy that.
That's great.
So I think this chapter for me is about helping other companies get where they want to go, and I'm having fun doing that.
Well, that's great. Well, so I said I'd come back to a board question. So you've sat on, I think, like up to 15 boards. So if you had a piece of advice, one or two pieces of advice to leaders to say, how should they interact with their boards? What are some best practices for leaders as they, manage through board situations?
Yeah. That is a phenomenal question. There are books that should be written for CEOs on how to deal with boards, and I have seen some things work really well. I've made some mistakes myself along the way working with boards, and I've been on boards where CEOs have just been masterful on dealing with their boards, and others where they haven't. So I've had the opportunity to see a lot of good and bad there. I think. A recipe for failure, I think, in dealing with a board is trying to manage your board the way you do your management team. And that kind of a CEO, first of all, probably should never be CEO and chairman combined. But even if you're not chairman, you don't manage your board that way. And I think the key is who you're able to put on your board or who's on the board when you decide to take a CEO role, because that's very, very important. And the people you need on your board, sure, you want subject matter experts. You need people who understand different things depending on the board search you're doing, but you need collaborators. You need people that are just really good thinkers, have great life and professional experience to bring to the table, who are thoughtful and reasoned in the way they approach problem solving and decision making, and who are naturally supportive of the team and what they're trying to accomplish. If you have those people on the board, it allows you to work with the board the way you should, which is allowing them to do their jobs, not telling them what decisions to come to, educating them, make sure they're as expert as you possibly can in your business and the issues at hand, and then hearing from them and engaging them in real dialogue. I think sometimes for CEOs, they're so sure they know what needs to be done with the business, they just don't want the board to screw it up. And they don't want the board to start going down the wrong path and asking them to waste their time. But the truth is, if you've got good people on your board, they're probably going to see things that you might not see. They might not know as much detail as you about the business, but they've got some other wisdom from their experience that you probably ought to hear from. And if you treat the board that way, they're going to end up giving you, in fact, a lot more latitude in the way you do your, obviously, if you're succeeding. And you're doing your job well, they're going to give you a lot more latitude. So I think that kind of respect and collaboration from the CEO, and not trying to manage the outcome, manage the information flow, manage where the decision process is going in a board deliberation, is really critical.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think that'll be very helpful to many people who listen to this. What are you most proud of, Keith, as you reflect on your 40 years?
What am I most proud of? I think, what I'm most proud of is is probably that some of the teams that I've been able to put together, and when things have gone really well, which has fortunately been most of them, watching their situation flourish and thrive, is seeing team members who you recruit into an organization, enjoy what they do, know that it was a good decision, want to work with you again, make money, learn a lot of things.
Yeah.
When you're able to put together really great teams and you see them benefit as a result, and many of them are friends to this day, that's I think what I'm most proud of. When I talk to somebody and they say I am that decision to join that company at that point in my career was the best thing that ever happened, that's incredibly gratifying. So creating that kind of value professionally for teams, creating value for shareholders along the way that we've done a handful of times. I'm really proud of those things.
As you should be. And as somebody said to me, right, it was that magical period, so that you created magic for many teams, hopefully.
Well, I hope that's even partly true. It certainly is the goal, but we'll see how many feel that way. But yeah, I'm glad you're.
So Keith, you have a 4-time CEO. You've turned around multiple companies, $2 billion exits, and just as I said, impacted so many teams and patients. Most importantly, you've impacted a lot of patients, and for that, you really should be proud of the legacy that you have in the MedTech sector. So my last question for you, as I think of this as kind of a leadership podcast, but if you had a leadership superpower, if that's something that you think has made you so successful, what would that be?
Well, let me make it clear. I don't believe that I have any superpowers. So
of course. Yes, you do.
I understand.
Just say you do.
I understand your question, but I think it's, I don't think it's quite as mystical as that. I think that if you ask me what are the things that I've done well, that have been most impactful as a leader, what is the skill set? I honestly think it is recruiting great people and then creating really, really energized cultures that are driven for performance. Because the rest of it is, that's the core. The rest of it is context. I mean, I've seen companies with, okay products and okay value propositions do really well, based on those things. And I have seen other companies that have just really killer products and technologies, well-financed, well-capitalized, who have just stumbled because they don't have those things. They aren't able to recruit great teams. They aren't able to create a culture that's functional and excited and energized. And those things aren't easy to do, and they're a little different in every company. But if you can do them, if you can really attract great people and then create that kind of culture where people just feel like they've got to win, they want to win, what they're doing is very visible, and they've got some control and some agency to make things happen in the organization, and they understand what good looks like at the end of it. And everybody's moving in the same direction. It's amazing, really, what you do. And particularly in these smaller to mid-sized companies, boy, that can impact growth and performance. It's just really quickly. It's a lot of fun to do and be a part of and watch.
That's great. Well, Keith, I can't thank you enough for your time. You've been so generous in, taking me through your leadership journey, through your story, and I wish you all the best and congratulations.
Well, thank you. It's been fun to reconnect with you after a lot of years.
I know,
Sheetal,
a lot of years.
We knew each other a long time ago, and
we did.
It's exciting to see what you're doing here. I wish you the best of luck with your podcast. I'm sure it'll be a huge hit.
Oh, well, thank you. And again, thank you for being a guinea pig in season 1. I appreciate it.
Glad to help.
All right. I'll talk to you soon, Keith.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sheetal. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.